right, so today we are going to be talking about George Washington's movement from Boston into New York City and then beyond. So we discussed yesterday how George Washington defeated the British at Boston and evacuated them from the city. And we know that perhaps it's not necessarily his fighting strategies, more of the fact that Howe was already on his way out towards New York City. There's no need for there's no need for Howe to stay in Boston. It is a lost city. There's no loyalists there. So he's going to leave and go to New York City. And like we had said, we know that his brother, the Admiral Howe, is going to be in New York City with his fleet, his naval fleet. So Washington is going to follow Howe down to New York City, not knowing what he's really going to be walking into. New York City has a convergence of 500 naval ships under Admiral Howe, and then with General Howe, William Howe, he has about 32,000 men with him. And those two are going to fight George Washington in New York. Now, George Washington's troops, he has a pretty good showing, right? So Howe has 32,000 men with the naval fleet, but George Washington has about 20,000 men with him as well. So though it's not as much as Howe, it still is a good showing. Now, we call it the Battle of New York City mostly because it happens all over the place. Fighting will occur in Long Island, in Queens, in Manhattan. You see here where it's called Fort Washington. If you've ever driven to New York City, one of the first streets you get to over the George Washington Bridge is Fort Washington. And Fort Washington was literally a fort at one point. And you'll see Fort Lee over here, right? We talked about Charles Lee. Anyway, George Washington will fight for weeks in New York. And like I said, he's fighting all over the place. And unfortunately, he's just outmanned every time. But to be honest with you, he's outranked and out-strategized as well. Howe is just giving all that he's got on George Washington. And by the time they are fighting, one of the last moments is Kip's Bay. It's called Kip's Bay, where they're fighting. George Washington will be working with his officers, and his officers will say, are we just going to fight till everybody dies, or what are we going to do here? And so George Washington will literally sneak out in the middle of the night before Howe can attack him further at Kip's Bay. So by the time the battle is over, Washington is down to 5,000 men. So he goes from 20,000 to 5,000. And the question is, what happened? Well, yeah, many of them were killed in battle. That is an accurate description. Most of them will be killed in battle, but not all of them. Some of them will be taken as prisoner of war. And if you're a prisoner of war for the British, right, you're not sent over to England. They actually have prisoner of war ships that they're going to have to stay on for the rest of the war. And this was almost a fate worse than death, because these prisoner of war ships were disastrous. They were dirty, and you were not fed, and they were disease-ridden, and most of the time you died. In fact, more people died on the prisoner of war ships than the actual battles by the time the war is over. So you do not want to be sent there. Now, New York City is really important to the war cause. The British see the Hudson River as a main artery through the colonies, especially up north. And whoever has control of the Hudson River in New York City has control of the northern and middle colonies, which is why Washington was so hesitant to leave New York City. But after a while, he had to, because he had nobody left. So he's forced to retreat out of New York City. And with head hanging low and tail between his legs, they will be marching out of New York and into Pennsylvania by the end of the fall of 1776. Now, I mentioned that it's the end of fall because you have to understand the timing of this all. It's starting to get cold. It's actually really right around now that he is leaving. The Battle of Fort Washington was like 2 days ago, literally November 16th. And so by the time it's all over, right, it's heading towards the beginning of winter, end of fall. And this relates to George Washington in that the men are suffering. I mean, when he is retreating out and through Pennsylvania, his men truly are suffering. We talked about them marching with no shoes on in the snow. This is when that's happening. It's frigid temperatures to the point where men are exhausted from marching, will sit on the side of the road and freeze to death. So if you are George Washington's men and you've literally volunteered for this, are you going to stay and probably die? No. And people were going AWOL. They were leaving. People were just walking off of rank and going home. George Washington couldn't do anything about it. He doesn't even blame them. So by the time December hits, Washington only has 2,388 men with him. That's it. So he started with 20,000, got down to 5,000, and now only has 2,388 men. Additionally, Congress not happy with George. He failed miserably, and his men are essentially going AWOL. So Congress is ready to give him the boot. They don't want George in power anymore as commander-in-chief. They want to kick him out. So George definitely and desperately needs a win. He also needs some sort of boost of morale for his men. He's got to prove to Congress he could do it. He's also got to prove to his men that they could do it. So this is where master strategist George Washington will come into play. This is where, when we talk about using strategy and knowing your enemy, will push us through this war. Washington hears about a Hessian encampment in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, Hessians, remember, are German, and his knowledge of this will aid in his movements. He will decide he's going to attack the Hessians at Trenton. This will lead to what's known as the Battle of Trenton. Now, many of you have seen this image before. At this point in time, this is Washington crossing the Delaware. Massive, beautiful painting that you can find in the Met today. It's like the size of a wall. And it depicts Washington crossing the Delaware to get to New Jersey, right? Because he's in Pennsylvania right now. He's got to cross over the Delaware to get to New Jersey. Now, this is what he's thinking, okay? It is winter, right? And by the time he reaches the Delaware River, it's just about Christmas Eve. And he knows that there's Hessians, right, in Trenton. And Hessians are German. And I have to tell you, the Germans basically invented Christmas. Every tradition that you know of Christmas is German. Christmas trees, Christmas carols, Santa. Do you put a pickle in your Christmas tree? Do that because that's a German tradition. If you don't, you should, because it's fun. You hide it, and then not a real one. We do ornaments now. They used to do real ones, but then it stinks, literally. And whoever finds it gets an extra present. But what he's thinking is the Germans are celebrating Christmas. They are not thinking that there's going to be a battle, right? So this is definitely a surprise sneak attack on the Hessians. And knowing his enemy, he's thinking that they're celebrating. And when I say celebrating, they're probably imbibing on some drinks and food and not ready to participate in a battle. Additionally, he knows, being German, they're probably going to have Christmas trees. And Christmas trees at the time did not have little fairy lights on them. They had candles on them. They literally put candles on dying trees for Christmas. It is a fire hazard nightmare, but he's hoping that this will play into his aid at the Battle of Trenton. So he crosses the Delaware. He reaches Trenton on December 6th. So it's literally the morning of December 26th. the day after Christmas, and everything that he had hoped would happen happened at Trenton. The Hessians were not ready. The Hessians had celebrated too much. They had Christmas trees. The Christmas trees from the battle got caught on fire and started burning down the encampment. It was everything Washington could ever hope for. And just within a few hours, barely even a few hours, the Hessians will surrender. And Washington's men, they only lost 6 men in this. Huge morale booster. They can raid the encampment, they can get shoes, they can get ammo, they can have food, right? It was a huge moment for Washington, and Washington knows, right, that this is something that he can use moving forward to keep his men going, right? He's going to ride this wave of morale to keep pushing forward. Now, most of the British are settling in for the winter, and Washington's like, no, not us, we're gonna keep going. And that's really what his job is, right? We don't need to win every battle, we just need to keep the war going. So he will continue this. Now, before we talk a little more about these battles, amazingly enough, George Washington, while raiding the Hessian encampment, will go to the commander of the Hessians' office. His name is Commander Rahl, R-A-H-L. And on Commander Rahl's desk is a letter that is sealed. And he's like, oh, maybe this is, information from Hal. Maybe it's information about, their movements or whatever it is. Anyway, he opens the letter, and inside is a letter from one of his former soldiers who left ranks and wrote to the Hessians telling of George Washington's position and possible attack on Trenton around Christmas. And the letter was never opened. So Commander Rahl had that info in his hand, but didn't do anything about it, probably because of Christmas. It was a moment where George Washington got a little lightheaded and needed to, take a deep breath, right? Because that could have been the end of him. But they didn't know, because he didn't read the letter. But what George Washington also was able to do, right? This is the end of the year. And when you sign a contract with the military, you have a year of service. So on January 1st, their service will be over. So Washington gave this very empowering speech to his soldiers, the very few remaining, the 382 that we now have. He said to them, I need you to stay with me for the cause of patriotism, do your country proud, yada, yada, yada. Stay with me 3 more months. Your country needs you. Now, he also offered them an extra $10 if they stayed, and all of them stayed. Was it the $10? Probably, but still, he got them all to stay. And he then took these soldiers who are ready and willing to fight to another battle almost immediately. Now, the next battle that will occur almost immediately is the Battle of Princeton. Now, you'll notice I have my little New Jersey map. Here's Trenton, here's Princeton. Now, Washington, thanks to his battle at Trenton, gets word that Lord Cornwallis, a British officer, is near Princeton with his troops. Now, Lord Cornwallis is sort of known around the world for being a tough military and well-respected officer. He has fought in around the world. He was in India. He fought in India to gain control of tea fields, right? So he's just a well-respected man. Now, remember, we need to control New Jersey because New Jersey will feed us, but the British are the same. So Lord Cornwallis's job is to gain control of New Jersey. So Washington hears that Cornwallis is at Princeton, and he's like, guys, we're going to keep the good times rolling. Let's attack Lord Cornwallis. And he does a very, very, very tricky and risky move. George Washington will split his troops in half. He will have the one half of his troops create a diversion. Basically, set up camp, put up campfires, set up tents, make noise, make Cornwallis think that we're done fighting for the winter, right? Make Cornwallis, whatever scout is out there watching us, make them think that we're not going to attack him. The other half of his troops snuck up behind Cornwallis's convoy and started stealing all of his supplies. Now, a convoy is a line of soldiers. It starts with your officers. Then in the middle of the line is your, foot soldiers, your regulars. And at the back of the line is all of your stuff. Literally dragging in wagons, you have cannons and ammo and weapons and supplies. And so in the dark of night, the other half that's not creating the diversion is sneaking up behind the convoy and stealing all of Cornwallis's stuff, so that when dawn arises, the other half that made the diversion is going to meet up with George Washington and they will attack Cornwallis with his own supplies. It got a little dicey. Washington at one point had to really rally his troops. He literally ran into the middle of the fighting and had his horse shot out from under him and had 2 bullets shot through his jacket, but he remained unscathed, inspiring his soldiers to fight. And he defeats Cornwallis at Princeton, and he basically follows Cornwallis up to Morristown, because Cornwallis was going to retreat there and camp there, and he will attack Cornwallis again at Morristown with the same result. He will win. And so this is 3 very necessary wins in a row, a defeat of Cornwallis twice, the Hessians once, and control over New Jersey. Washington proved that he is able to do this, right? So if I were to look at his resume, right, Boston, Trenton, Princeton, Morristown, those are 4 wins under his belt within just a few months. But New York City was a disaster, right? So he still has to prove himself. So we have control of New Jersey. Washington's doing a good job now. He feels like his position is secure. He's not worried that he's going to get fired anymore. And now Washington has to truly make an encampment. And this is where we will see Washington at Valley Forge in 1777, his lowest point for his soldiers. We'll talk about that tomorrow. On Schoology, you have a reading about the Battle of Princeton. It is a letter that Washington writes to Congress, basically telling them of the very heroic battle at Trenton. And you have 3 questions that you're going to answer based on his reading. When you're done, submit that. I will be back tomorrow. I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk soon. Bye.